Public Works, joined by my colleague Elaine Mejia out in North Carolina, who will be really taking the lead on this particular webinar. Also, two great guest speakers. We're glad to have been working with on this topic with them, Denise Cardinal and Susanna O'Daniel. So many of you, as I see from the sign-ins that I'm seeing people connect in with today, have been with us on previous webinars, and we really appreciate that. A couple of heads ups about this. Everybody who's attending is in mute, but you've got the opportunity to ask questions of any of us on the panel, any of the presentations, using that kind of question and chat function there on your little panel for the webinar. So please feel free to do that. We will leave some time at the end to have some discussion, and that's the best way to do that. If anybody's having technical problems, that's probably another way to also let us know if you've got anything we can try and help answer. As many of you know, Public Works has been working for about a decade to try and rebuild faith and trust and support for government. We work around the country with community leaders and advocates and public servants, all trying to change the conversation we have in this country about the public sector and public services. Part of that, I think, in the recent years, we've recognized that the kind of political campaigns and campaign season is both an opportunity and also offers some hazards when we're trying to have a conversation about the role of government. And so I'm going to turn it over to Elaine to kind of begin this topic and lay out for us what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think our plan for today is really four parts. The first is to spend a few moments telling you all why we think the election season, election years, as daunting and sometimes negative as they can seem, also present tremendous opportunities to really shape the conversation in your state. We know so many of you are already doing that. The second part is to highlight some of our recommendations, and particularly to look at how our sort of core findings about how people think and reason about government play out in election years, and get some examples of how our advice about how reframing and influencing those conversations can really influence nonprofit and C3 election year appropriate activities, how you can sort of embed those recommendations or infuse them into election year activities. And then we've got a case study from Arkansas, where Susanna O'Daniel from previously to Arkansas Advocates for Children, now just recently went over to the Arkansas MEEA affiliate, will be really sharing a case study of how she, both through the organization she was with and is with now, are really putting some of these ideas into practice on the ground to shift the conversation there. And then finally, the fourth piece is your questions, trying to leave hopefully 15 minutes or something like that for you all to chime in with ideas or questions or things that you think we need to talk about. So that's the plan for today. Should I proceed, or is it back to you, Patrick?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I have the controls. Do I have the controls now? Do you have the control now of the slides, or do I, Patrick?
I can do them. It's fine. I'll click it over for you.
Okay. I think we can skip this one. This just summarizes what I said is the plan for today. A quick disclaimer on the next slide about advice we are and are not offering. You all know from the introduction Patrick gave about the work that we do at Public Works and the work we've been doing with you all, many of you all out in the field for so long, that we think clearly that elections are fundamentally, or at least in part, about the role of government in our lives. And we also believe that all of us, through our own activities, our organizational activities, and then how we influence the participation and actions of our supporters, our followers, constituents, can help to reshape those conversations in productive ways. And use election years as an opportunity to tap into the fact that more people are tuning in to really build a foundation, because I know that most of you all in our work with you tells us that following an election, what you want to see is real changes and policy solutions happening in your state and in your community. And we also plan to share some resource links for other election season advice. It's important to note on our end that we are not legal experts about what exactly you can do given whatever your particular role is with respect to election season activities. We will share some resources about places you can look for those things. And for specific legal questions, we are not the place for that. You can find an attorney, but we do find whenever we go and look at those resources ourselves, that usually we come away with a sense of, yeah, we can usually do a lot more than you thought you could do. So moving on, it probably is worth one slide to say that, yes, clearly election years present some particular challenges. But, stereotypes about government are in the forefront all the time in the media coverage and things that candidates might say. But another challenge we've been thinking about lately is how voting, as important and as essential it is to the health of our democracy, is often portrayed in election years as the only means of participation. So it's important, obviously, to encourage voting and that way of participating, but in a way that makes people want to engage further and then participate with you and your organization in your ongoing campaigns for change. So that's another caution, I think, in our minds about heading into election year season. And then the third is that obviously the tendency is to, for political actors, to be able to set and define the agenda and get to say which issues are important and which issues are not. But I know from seeing the list of the folks who are on this webinar right now and some of the groups we work with that you all have tremendous expertise, often much more expertise than political actors on the scene, about what's really going on in your state and in your communities and what the real challenges are and what the solutions, what solutions should be considered that would actually make a meaningful difference. So it's a tremendous opportunity for you all to influence and actually set and define the agenda about what issues are important, not just responding to what issues that the media or candidates during an election year want to put forward as the top issue, but instead really set the agenda or influence the agenda sort of from the ground up. Next slide, Seth. So we really, as we've said before, see election years and election seasons as an opportunity. It's actually incredible. Denise Cardinal with Progress Now, who has been working with them on preparing for this, shared an interesting statistic with us recently where she was talking about 85% of Americans going online to seek information to inform their vote, which is just really tremendous. It gives us a sense of a tremendous opportunity because you all have an established, credible voice in your community and in your states and in some cases around the nation as a place, and you already have websites with tremendous resources already set up and blogs that are active and have followers. I mean, you have an established, credible voice as a leader and an expert and are so well positioned to tap into this energy in the form of this 85% going to look for information to help inform their vote, help them assess what proposals that are out there are, should actually really be considered, shifting from the election, obviously, into government and making changes. So, so clearly, we see election seasons as tremendous opportunities, but it goes without saying that our public conversation about government could stand quite a bit of improvement. So, the big picture goal then, right, is that we need to change and put ourselves out there more both as individuals and organizations, and then arming our allies and our constituents and the people that follow us in our organizations with the capacity to really change and shape what the debate is really about. And there are tremendous opportunities to plug in and to influence these conversations. Many of you might be participating in voter registration and encouraging voters to get engaged, particularly new voters, first-time voters, voters that have traditionally had barriers to voting, different ways. You might be hosting in or participating or encouraging your followers to participate in candidate forums. You might be contributing to or producing yourself issue briefs, voter guides. Certainly hope that many of you are also writing op-eds or writing letters to the editors in response to news media coverage about campaigns and about how the issues are being framed, shaped. And I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, are also doing some sort of social networking activities. So there are all of these and even more, we can come up with a longer list of this, are opportunities to influence this conversation and really help to shape the debate ourselves and reframe these conversations in more productive ways so that we're setting ourselves up for better policy changes, once the election season through. So the second, the second element of our conversation today, what are the key elements needed to change the conversation? Many of you who have worked with us out in the field or have been part of presentations before will not be surprised to see that this is just a refresher on our core findings from our, as Patrick said, more than 10 years of ongoing research about, well, what are the public attitudes about government that really are getting in the way of people seeing a more active role for government and the need for policy and the need for and the ability of public policy to even make a difference in our lives. And we know that these are the three fundamental hurdles, right? People equate government with politics, and clearly that's front and center in election years with negative ads and debates and figures about fundraising and so on and so forth just in the media all the time. And the second, this tendency of Americans to lump all of the work of government into just sort of one mindless category and then label it with terms like wasteful, or even label it altogether with a good term like essential. But the point is, it's lumping it all together and therefore obscuring the actual work that's going on outside of it. So the role of programs, the role of services, the role of policy. And then finally, people have, with respect to how they view their own relationship to government, tend to see it as, first and foremost, as a vending machine relationship, a consumer-based relationship. I just want to think about what's in it for me and how much is it going to cost, and really have a very narrow view of their own relationship. Another finding, from our research was specifically with respect to our relationship with elected officials. This is a very narrow but dominant sort of cycle that people have in their mind. We, sort of the public and the voters, occasionally get to go to the polls and elect our elected officials or these leaders. And then in turn, what happens after that is they sort of just govern us. And it's a very limited cycle, and it leaves out some key important elements, which I'm going to cover in just a minute. So shifting to the next slide, those of you who've worked with us in the past will have already seen that we think there's really three core elements to shifting this conversation overall. First and foremost is about leading with the essential values that people associate with the work of government and the sort of core importance of government. Values like common good, quality of life, community well-being, really leading with the fundamental mission and purpose of public systems and policies. And the second is triggering some systems and structures thinking, which is what we usually call it, right? Which is about making the actual work real, getting vivid images as possible, getting away from just using lumped together terms like government or public services writ large, and really mentioning the actual work that's going on behind the scenes and how things work and what those benefits are. And then finally, anytime with all of our communications, consistently expanding or broadening the role people that see for themselves with respect to government, seeing it beyond the vending machine and seeing their essential role as citizens, both as voters, but then also more as a citizen manager and a partner with our elected officials once they're elected in really making change happen. And this is we showed before, the very limited scope. People is the default thinking where it's just we, the voters, we go out and elect our elected officials and they govern us. Well, this shows you the full story that we need to be out there, which includes a few other key essential elements. You'll see that the term govern has really been shifted more to build and maintain. We elect our elected officials, and they have a role to play. That is not just about governing us, so to speak, but it's about building and maintaining these essential things that we have set up over time in our communities, in our states, in our country, these public structures, whether that's Social Security or if it's our voting laws or could be, sometimes it clearly could be expanding these things. But they have a role of building and maintaining these public structures because, and here's what the other essential element involved in, right? Because those things yield benefits to all of us. And you'll see then, of course, benefits then feed back into the loop. So core dimensions that need to be part of that story and are often left out in election season. So thinking about how you put these ideas into practice, we'll just take a look at a few examples. So first, we'll just how does it look like to practice these things in, for example, a candidate forum setting, in an issue guide or a voter guide, in your actual engagement with voters, potential voters, and citizens around the need to participate. And then in another role that many of you are already do and certainly will be doing, which is responding to anti-government rhetoric that's so prevalent during campaign season. We really love this quote. If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. So we need to ask the right questions. And what are the core elements of those questions? Well, our questions need to, keep the focus on the public systems and services and how they're going to be managed in the public interest. And we also really need to appeal to people's common sense and the natural desire, which we know from our own research, the natural desire people have to make government work on behalf of ordinary people. And then we always need to take advantage of any opportunity we have to clarify ideas about what is sort of uniquely and inherently public and why. And we need to avoid, with our questions, triggering stereotypical thinking, which sounds simple enough, but can often be pretty challenging. I'll show an example of that just in a minute. And we, in any time with our questions, I think it's important to recognize that with candidate forums, for example, if you're going to participate in those yourself or encourage people that you're working with your own constituents to participate in them, the way in which we frame and ask questions is also, we're also then modeling for all of the people in the room. It's really not just about getting a particular answer, setting up our candidate. It's about modeling for all of the people in the room how to think about these things. So clearly probing how citizens will be involved as partners in governing, just beyond just merely selecting candidates, is so important. So let's do just a couple of examples. So this is an example of a forum question. Again, you all will want to put these things in your own words, but this imagines that you'll sort of lead off with something that talks about the impacts of budget cuts to public services. Be careful always to give real examples of what those things were and what the impacts were. Again, we don't want to fall into that trap of lumping all of the work of government and public services together. Got to make it vivid and real for people in order to really impact how they think. And then, the question you can see taps into some of the recommendations we were talking earlier about. What are your plans for rebuilding? Again, we said in the graphic that shows that we need people to think not just of the role of the elected officials as governing us, but also building and maintaining these things that will benefit health. So what are your plans for rebuilding? The public systems that are essential to a strong and prosperous community. And you see there at the end, community, the idea of community well-being is one of those essential values that people associate with the necessary role for government. So again, you've got some of those recommendations in action in this example. We've got one more. You can see in this one, we're trying to get at that citizen angle, which is reminding both of the people in the room as well as the candidates themselves that there's an expectation that our relationship with elected officials does not just stop at the voting, in the voting booth, but it goes far beyond that, right? How are you going to keep us all engaged and informed? How are you going to really partner with us in an ongoing way once you're already elected? Again, triggering that citizenship type of thinking. And you might be the organization in the room who's very well positioned to help people plug into the process, really, going forward, even after candidate forms and after election. We have one real-world example of this, which we found helpful from California. Really just probably look at the top two of these. But so if you could tell California voters one thing about your commitment to the health and well-being of children. Again, health and well-being, sort of community well-being, sort of leading with core essential values. And then the second question as well, which really speaks to the common sense action steps approach that we were talking about earlier too. If elected, what steps would you take, right, to make the health and well-being of children higher priority health? So just one example of what this sort of looks like on the ground in real time. Now shifting to issue and voter guide. I know Susanna in a little bit is going to share an example of voter guide, or an issue guide, I should say, issue or voter guide in Arkansas that she's been part of that's being released this week. But here's some highlights of what we see as essential. I mean, clearly these are tremendous opportunities to actually educate voters on the issues, because you've got a little more space than you might have in the soundbite at a candidate forum, right? You can actually educate voters on the issues. It's a tool for highlighting the work of the public sector. You can show successes in a voter guide. Here are things that we've done in our community and through this agency and through this policy that made a difference. And clearly, they connect the dots, which is so essential, right, between the active voting and then the policy and program choices that are at stake. You need to get people beyond just saying voting in election seasons are about it's my team winning or is your team winning, but it's really about who's going to then put into place the kind of policy and program choices that are going to make a real difference in my life, my family's life, and the community. So on to the next slide. It's so important to foster that systems thinking. Emphasize how the whole community is affected, not just particular constituencies. Be explicit about the role government can and should play. Always including solutions in there and not just saying we need to have this, but what actually needs to be in place to make it work. And again, towards giving people a broader sense of their own role, give them people a role to play, give them questions to ask, arm them with a list of ways to participate beyond just reading and looking into the voter initiative, looking at the voter initiative guide. An example of this from the last major election cycle was the North Carolina Justice Center put out a series of issue briefs on a whole range of issues. It's an anti-poverty organization, so they were generally in that direction. We can go to the next slide, Patrick. You can see at the top that they are clearly connecting this issue brief with your voice, your vote with the election season. What we really liked about them was that they gave a little bit of background, and then they armed people with well-framed questions that have to do with the system, really. You can go to the next slide, Patrick. Yeah, so a little bit of background about the system, why is it so important, and then it connects the dots between the elections and the policy choices that will make this system either work or conversely or not work. Connects the dots, puts forth the goals in the program. So important to be aspirational and say, here's what this program will look like if it actually works and has the resources that it needs. And then we have one example of that is not such a great example. It's from a League of Women Voters questionnaire. Thanks, candidates. You can go to the next slide. And this is an example of a question that was, what measures should the Senate take to stop the gridlock that's crippled Congress? Well, obviously, that's an important thing to talk about. We all need to be able to talk about the gridlock because, the idea that sort of the game is rigged is very real and genuine. But on the other hand, we need to be able to talk about that in ways that make it seem like it's possible to change and make it seem like me getting involved or voters getting involved can actually make a difference, right? We don't want to reinforce some of the stereotypes. So this is really framed as it's just politics, nothing's going to get done. And instead we need to shift towards aspirational things that are still connected to this idea of the system is rigged, right? About leadership, about decision-making and collaboration. So we created another hypothetical situation. Like, what steps would you take to be a leader? What steps, what will you do to get things done? How can decision, so you can just read this question. So what role do you see yourself in having in helping the Senate move beyond this gridlock towards deliberation and consensus? Again, really leading more with your own goals and values. It's so easy to fall into the don't think of an elephant trap, for example. Somebody so easy to want to respond with just restating a negative stereotype about government. And we know, many of you are also either yourselves or in participation with other organizations in engaging voters. And so beyond just, telling people about polling sites and how to actually vote, or it's so important to think about what are we telling people about why elections actually matter. Again, it's not just about is my side winning or is your side losing, and it's not just about you specifically and reinforcing those consumer attitudes about here's how you are going to benefit, here's how much it will cost you if this thing is enacted. We really need a broader story. It's about who will oversee and help to manage these systems that are in place and give examples that we rely on every day that are essential to our community, to the future of our community. And again, always with both uplifting the importance of voting while at the same time making it always clear that our civic responsibility really doesn't mean there and that people need to stay engaged and continue to participate. We did have one example of an organization that we have worked with in the past few years that we think we have done a great job at sort of modeling this, and that is Mobilize the Immigrant Vote out of California. This was some language that was in the introductory portion of their 2012 voter guide, but we also know from working with them and talking with them about how they were actually engaging voters one-on-one, door-to-door, that this also shows you how they were communicating with voters one-on-one, right? Again, about leading with values, about shaping the future of our country, our state, and our community. That's what voting is really about. And what's also really interesting is this phrase about how an informed Latino electorate will benefit all of our states, right? And again, avoiding the tendency to really talk about constituencies in a very narrow way. But this is really about how this will benefit everyone in the broader community. So again, connecting the dots, right, gives concrete example, and it's so important to give concrete examples of upcoming decisions, challenges, opportunities. And in some communities, it's also particularly important to highlight the impact of past decisions. In some communities who haven't had a particularly great experience with government or with elected officials doing things when once elected to make a great difference in their communities, it's so important in terms of motivating people to engage, not just in voting, but then beyond that, to be able to point to past decisions when the community came together and did some great thing, even if it was something small about, getting the park fixed, or when we got this change made to our school, or whatever it is, reminding people that by working together, success and change can really happen. It's so important to give examples of how citizen engagement has improved things in the past. And then finally, we know so many of you already are and will be working to deflate anti-government. You are the experts, so many of you. You've got statistics on how government programs are functioning and what they need to function better. And, we thought about giving a lot of examples of responding to specific things, but instead we thought we'd just share our overarching recommendation with you. These are, what these are. You'll see them all the time, right? Big, broad statements about waste, fraud, and abuse, transparency and accountability, lots of very heated rhetoric about taxes and tax dollars. This is standard: running government like a business, getting government out of the way, ending dependence on government, and you can play such an important role in responding to these, reframing these, and deflating, to use our words. And our big picture recommendation about addressing these is essentially that order is what's most important. Again, it's so easy to fall into the don't think of an elephant trap. For example, when asked to respond to, or when you want to respond to something about waste, fraud, and abuse, you say, oh, this public system in our state, our schools, our Medicaid system is not nearly as wasteful as you just depicted in your op-ed or in your comments or whatever it was. And of course, that's never going to get us where we need to go. So we want to lead first and foremost with our own values and purpose. So these are some hypothetical language, but connect the values and purpose first, then make it real, mention the specific systems that you're talking about, the work they do, and then respond to those specifics. You say, then put in your fact about, that refutes the claim about waste or refutes the claim about taxes being too high or whatever it is. So first and foremost, lead with your own vision. That's really what's going to, over time, really serve to reframe these conversations in a much bigger way, in a more impactful way. So those are some highlights of how we see that these, our core recommendations of public work that we've developed for our research and working with you all in the field for so long can really translate into some election year activities that you might just be participating in. And now we want to shift to Susanna O'Daniel from Arkansas, who we've been working with for the past year, and we really admire the work that she's been doing there, along with the rest of the folks that she works with there. And she's going to talk about some things that they actually have going on right now on the ground in Arkansas that are really sort of aimed at shaping the debate in their state. So I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Public Works, for inviting me to highlight some of the things that we have going on here in Arkansas, and hopefully will be helpful to you all as you think about what kind of state-level activities you can do to kind of apply some of the things that Elaine has talked about today. First of all, I just wanted to talk about specifically in Arkansas some opportunities that we have this cycle, and certainly to some of the points that Elaine has covered, we definitely think of the election cycle as a major opportunity because people are paying attention and they are engaging. And with every passing day that we get closer to November, we are getting more and more folks to tune in and sit up and figure out who they're going to vote for and what issues are important to them. And so here in Arkansas, we have a major governor's race on the ballot. We have a big U.S. Senate race on the ballot. All 100 members of our House, of our State House, are going to be up for election. And so that obviously is going to be a major opportunity for those of us who work primarily at the state level. In the 2012 election cycle, our House was controlled by just one Republican. So there are 100 members, and the Republicans had 51. And that's the first time since Reconstruction after the Civil War that the Republicans have controlled the state house in Arkansas. So it's really a major opportunity in the 2014 cycle to get out there and make sure people are listening, paying attention, and are engaged in these issues. So those are some of the opportunities that we have in Arkansas. And the other thing I want to mention about the climate in Arkansas is that we were the only state in the South that chose to expand Medicaid. And so that has been a major issue in our state. And the way our budget works, we're going to have to vote every single year to reappropriate the funding to do that. And so that's going to be another battleground issue as we move forward. So that's kind of the climate in Arkansas that we're working within and engaging in this conversation with folks around the state. So those are some of the opportunities and some of the races that we are going to be paying attention to and hoping other folks pay attention to. I wanted to really just give a couple of real-world examples about what we are doing here on the ground in the legislative districts. And I wanted to kind of shape the conversation as where do we go, what do we do when we get there, and how exactly we put it all together. Some of you may be familiar with our Policy Cafe model. And Policy Cafes are essentially a 3-hour mini-conference that we do in legislative districts around the state. This election season, we actually just kicked it off last week, and we are going to be doing a total of 4 of these Policy Cafes around the state. And where we go is determined by really sitting down and looking at the election data from the 2012 cycle. So we looked at what state house races were determined by 10% of the vote or less. Because these policy cafes are very time intensive and staff intensive, we wanted to make sure that our resources were used as strategically as possible. And while we have targeted, or we are targeting the districts, but we are kind of narrowing the list of which districts really need to hear about these issues, we are looking at about 10 House districts where we need to make sure that these issues are included in the local debate. And so we have chosen kind of strategically regions around the state that kind of encompass each of those House districts in that catchment area for the different towns, where people will drive in from some of the surrounding counties to participate in these. So we're doing a season of 4 of these Policy Cafe models around the state. And that's kind of how we decide where we go. So where can we strategically be heard? Where does the media market cover? Because we always include the media. But that's kind of a little bit about where we decide, or how we decide where we want to go. And then as far as what we do once we get there, we really just engage folks in conversation. But the really important part about how we structure it is it's very intentional in that we have an opening session with all of the participants who come about the role of government, and we specifically bring in a discussion about the tax and budget policy and how that impacts every single issue area that we're going to discuss today, and those the day of the event. And those can range from pre-K to child hunger to we could have a separate table about tax and budget policy, but public health issues. So a wide variety of issues are represented during the day in these conversations. So we have an opening session to kind of set the tone, set the frame about, what is the role of government, and help participants kind of receive the information throughout the day with that frame. And then we allow the participants to choose, usually from either 3 to 4 different offerings. So one table may discuss pre-K, another table may discuss public health, and there could be 3 or 4 options. Those conversations last about 45 minutes when we have a policy expert at the table that leads the conversation. But instead of a normal kind of conference where participants are kind of talked at, this is really a conversation with. So it allows us to have a feedback loop from the folks who are largely service providers in the local area to talk about, what they're hearing, and make sure that what we are saying at the local level will resonate with the folks there, and also the messaging in the media. So that's kind of where we go and what we do once we get there. But how we really put it all together, since Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families is a policy shop, like many of you on the call, we don't have a lot of name recognition always within the legislative districts. And so what we'll do is partner with a local service provider. So it will either be, a pre-K provider, it could even be a food bank, a group like that, court-appointed special advocates. If you have that organization in your state, they've often been a great partner. And so they will really essentially allow us to use their name on the invitation. We will build up other partners, sometimes statewide partners, who will also kind of co-present and help us get the word out to their members. And so that allows us to really build up a good group of participants. And the most important thing about it, and I think Elaine really touched about, that this is an ongoing conversation beyond the election cycle. So when folks come to the event, they sign in, and we specifically ask them to provide their home address. Because once we get that information about participants who we've essentially now had at least one conversation with, we put them into our database. And so when the legislative session is going on and there's an issue and we say, oh, there's somebody in Jonesboro where we just had a policy cafe, we need them to contact their legislator. We can run a query in our database and find out, who all, have we engaged with in that area before, and make sure that they reach out to their legislator. So it really helps us kind of build that political power, but also build a group of folks who are already engaged in those issues. And so that's really part of the follow-up to that, is it's not a conversation that has an end to it. We prep all the participants to anticipate, to expect that they will be hearing from us throughout the year as different pieces of legislation are introduced, and that their lawmakers need to hear from them. So that's kind of a quick overview of how that event works. The other thing that I wanted to show you is this is hot off the press, and I know Elaine kind of talked about a couple of different types of voters' guides. This is one that we just released this last week, and we have done one every election cycle for the past several cycles. This one I'm actually really, really proud of, because we really had a conversation as a staff to say, we don't want to send people with a big booklet. We all are bombarded with information. So really we kind of narrowed it down just to as little, not as little information, but just to make it as concise as possible. And so it's really kind of a small, I think it's about a 4 or 5 way fold brochure size document. So we're not handing people a big booklet that they feel intimidated by. We want to eliminate as many barriers to folks participating in the conversation at the local level as possible. And so we did develop this voter's guide for this election cycle, and I just kind of listed the example of the minimum wage question in there, and because I know that a lot of folks are probably going to have minimum wage either on the ballot or as a big part of the conversation happening in their state, so I chose this example to share with you. And on this particular question, we actually had the luxury of a pretty big poll, really, to kind of make sure that the messaging on this issue was what people really responded to in supporting the minimum wage in Arkansas, which is polling right now at about 77% favorability in the state. So I wanted to just provide you all with kind of a way to think about ways to model these in-district conversations with folks, and then kind of get a sense of what materials we had developed and are using out in the field, like this voter's guide.
Thank you, Susanna. This is Patrick, and just I know you've done these for a little while already, these policy cafes, correct?
That's right.
And so any reflections on kind of what it has done for you or for engagement in that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. This is about, I think, our 5th year that we have done this model, which has been extremely well received. And as I mentioned, it really helps prep our advocates in the field to know what is the conversation happening at the state capitol. I care about child welfare. I care about pre-K. These kind of singular issues will drive folks to the table and drive them to these events. And they really leave feeling well prepared to discuss these things, not only with their colleagues, their contacts, but also their lawmakers. So we really feel like it's helped kind of arm people with that information. And some people show up who are very engaged, and some people show up and say, I don't even know who my legislator is. So we really help connect folks on various levels to the process and to the conversation.
And have you seen some evidence that has rippled up to some of the lawmakers, or have you had lawmakers themselves attend some of these?
Absolutely. In fact, just last week we had one of these events in Northwest Arkansas, and it was actually kind of a longer version. It was a 5-hour version, and the state senator in that area came for the entire 5 hours. And actually we kind of just turned the floor over to him for a few minutes to really talk about, what are the best ways that advocates can engage with him, and how does he find that in the flood of emails and in the flood of other types of communications that he receives. What is the best way to really get the word through to him? And so we often have candidates or lawmakers themselves who show up at minimum at the beginning for the first hour to say, hey, I care about kids' issues. I know this conversation is happening. And, you know, the other thing is it has this kind of synergistic effect where people say, you know, I'm interested in pre-K, and people may not even know who else is a pre-K advocate in their area. So physically being in a space together has really produced some results where people feel supported and say, you know, when we call you during the legislative session, we're going to call the other 60 people who came to this event to help communicate that back to their legislators. And we have really seen, you know, if we have a bill in the Public Health Committee and say we need to move 2 legislators to yes, we have essentially a standing list of people who we've recently had a conversation with about, you know, about that very issue, and we can energize them and get them on the phones to their legislators.
Great. We've got a couple of people are writing some questions, so a reminder to people online, if you have some questions that some of this material has triggered for you, go ahead and type them in and we'll get to them. Some are kind of general, and I'm going to let Elaine finish up our slides to get to, but there are a couple of very specific questions for you, Susanna, that maybe
Sure.
we'll just deal with right now.
Absolutely.
Someone asked whether or not your policy cafes are based on the World Cafe model, which is a model for kind of dialogue, public dialogue, just because it has a similar name. I didn't know if that's something, if that's true.
I'm not familiar with that, but I would love to learn more about that. It is not based on that as far as I know.
Sure. And for those who are interested in it, there is a World Cafe method, which is based on kind of 7 public dialogue principles, and people can look that up if you want to. We had a question about your voter guide when you were trying to keep it kind of simple and pretty succinct. Can you give people a sense of what the cost was and kind of the production of that for you guys?
Well, gosh, I wish I knew that. That has gone through our communications director.
Okay.
I worked on actually compiling the information, but we designed it and laid it out in-house as part of the role of our communications director, who designs all of our materials. So really, as far as external cost, it was just the printing. And
Yeah.
you can't really tell from this picture, but it's a full-color, glossy, kind of, it's essentially, if you unfolded it, it would be one long sheet.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll follow up with you and we can post some
Sure.
notes about that. And then the last question I had for you was, how do you go about building attendance for your policy cafes, and how many people usually attend?
Yeah, that's a great question. We usually have a minimum of about 40 people. We've had as many as 70. Any more than that, it does get a little unwieldy, and you have to kind of add additional table topics for each rotation, so that you don't have more than 10 or 12 folks at a table, because sometimes that can go into kind of a large group communication process, which is different than the small group that we're hoping to kind of develop at these. So we build partnerships. Like I said, we make sure that folks at the local level know about it and that they get the word out to their contacts. We place notices in the local newspapers, and you may be surprised to know a lot of the local chambers of commerce very eagerly put it in their newsletters to all of their members, and we've actually had great results from some of those partners. We also have a database, like I said, we've been building for years, so re-engaging with folks who've been part of our events in the past. We send the invitation out to those. But I also have some partners who kind of also work on the statewide level, so like the Arkansas Hunger Relief Alliance, for example. They're the kind of the state level organization for all the food banks in Arkansas. So they will send it out to all of their food banks in the area, and then they send it on and on and on. And so it's really developing those partnerships that have contacts, constituents at the local level or members, and they kind of help us have that ripple effect to get the word out.
That's great. Thank you. And we may circle back to you with some more questions here in just a second.
Sure.
Elaine, I know you wanted to just kind of wrap up quickly and share a couple of resources that you've dug up. So.
Yeah, if you want to head on over to the next slide. Absolutely, and thank you very much, Susanna, for joining on this call. And I think the work that you're really doing, and what I'm most impressed about as part of the policy at cafes is the introduction, setting the stage by leading with a conversation about the role of government as a way to frame up those days. And hopefully that's really setting the stage for you to have such great participation from those folks, following the event. As we said from the outset, we are not the group that gives the legal expertise about where the boundaries are, but we've clearly one resource many of you all heard of, which is so excellent on that point, is the Alliance for Justice. We'll put a link here to their main website, but also to one particular resource we thought we've seen recently what was really helpful, about, commenting on candidates and campaigns and what you can really do in responding in an election year. It's a little bit tricky to find that resource just by navigating to their website, so we put the actual address on the page, and then as we have followed, we sit on some of their webinars. Nonprofit Vote really does a great job of helping you see how much you can do and showing you examples. And then clearly, a national model for going on 100 years now for participation in informing voters and encouraging them to participate not only in an election year, but then tapping into that energy beyond for real policy change as the League of Women Voters. So those are some few final resources. And, again, we really see this as a tremendous opportunity, and hopefully showing you some examples of how the recommendations that we have worked on for so long and in practice with many of you all out in the field can translate into shaping the conversation in the election year, and also particularly in a way that builds towards better public understanding of the role of government and the role of good policy and active government, setting the stage then for the kind of policy changes we all want to see in the years ahead.
Great, thanks, Elaine.
And if there are more questions, of course, Patrick, feel free to throw them out.
Yeah, there's a few more that are typing in I'll get to here in a second. Several people asked about the slides, and so this webinar is being recorded, and the copies of the slides and any other kind of resource materials will be posted on our website. If you have signed up for this webinar, which is probably how you got here, then you will get an email letting you know when all of that is available on the website. So several people asked about that, and we're always happy to share that material. Another question we got, actually, Susanna, your communications director weighed right in, and he said that the voter's guide was designed using InDesign software. It's an 8x14 sheet folded up like a brochure, and he says printing costs are about $750 for pretty good quality paper. Thank you. Thank you, Gerard.
Gerard's the best. Thanks, Gerard. Teamwork.
And I think that was for about 400 copies, he says. So good tag team there. We also had a question for any advice for targeting efforts in states that have a chronic one-party environment with very few competitive races, which, as we know, tends to dampen down enthusiasm and the turnout. So I don't know if anybody, Susanna, Elaine, have any thoughts about that, trying to generate enthusiasm and engagement when a lot of times it may seem futile?
Well, I guess I take the approach of looking what's on the entire ballot for each district. So while the state house race may not be the one that's exciting, maybe there's an issue campaign or some other way to kind of tap into the imagination of the folks at the local level. So sometimes I try not to focus on each individual race when I'm trying to kind of gain support or gain entry to the public conversation in an area, and I look at the entire ballot. So if there's a U.S. Senate race, if there's a governor's race, something like that, and particularly if there is a central issue, and that's kind of why I highlighted the debate around Medicaid expansion in Arkansas as being one of the central issues, which I can't really think of a more heated debate that we've had about that particular issue in our country. And so that has been one that has brought folks to the table in a way of thinking outside of, any particular race and seeing that as a barrier to being a part of the local dialogue.
No, that's good advice. Elaine, anything you wanted to add to that?
I think one thing that we covered a little bit, which is being able to point to successes. Sometimes those are defensive successes, but oftentimes you might need to reach a little further back into history to point towards successes. Things that you've done that at great moments in the state's history when you've come together and actually got nothing done, and that can take a little work to map those out. And that's also related to, but we didn't talk about on the webinar today, Patrick, some of the work we've done in some states that are really eyeing sort of long-term cultural change in their states, and groups are coming together to do what we kind of loosely call state narrative work, which is kind of developing a new story about who you are as a state and who you are as a people, developing that in partnership with lots of other organizations and leaders in your state, and then beginning to infuse your dialogue with that story too. Like in our being able to say, as a people, we have always been at our best when we have done A, B, and C, and here are moments in our state's history when we came together to solve problems and do things together, or we used our government as a tool. I'm just throwing out some examples, but if you're in a state when you're in sort of that longer-term building mode, but you want to still be able to engage people and give them hope, I think You might want to think about some sort of state narrative work and storytelling about your state and the people of your state. And we'd be happy to have a follow-up conversation, I'm sure, with anybody who's interested in that on places where we've done that kind of work.
Great, that's helpful. Well, that's all the questions I have at the moment, so if anybody's got something burning that they want to have us talk about, then type it in there for us. Otherwise, we're winding down here with our great guests. Any other last thoughts before we begin to shut down, Elaine or Susanna?
Well, I just wanted to say, I know several folks have asked me at different conferences if they can kind of come in and visit and just physically see what the Policy Cafe model looks like. And I just want to welcome anybody who's on the line that wants to take a trip to Arkansas. We'd love to host you and have you to just physically see what those cafes look like, if that's a model you're interested in bringing into your state. We'd be happy to have you.
Great, thanks for that invite. And so if it's okay with you, then when we post these materials, we may have to list your email address so people can find you.
Absolutely, be happy to.
Great. All right, since I think we've run out of the questions, we're going to cut you loose a little bit early. Elaine, thank you as always for putting this webinar together and getting some great guests to join us with some good examples. Thank you all of our attendees for joining in another Public Works webinar. As I mentioned, these materials will be posted on our website. You'll get an email notice about that. Stay tuned for future webinars coming up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.